welcome to stand here for the intro, or you can stand behind the podium for a sec.
Okay.
Whatever's good with you.
Okay, cool.
I'm going to go back there, and once we go live, I'll give you a thumbs up.
Okay.
You can get started, and we'll hand it over to you.
Okay, sweet. I'm gonna go behind the podium if that's okay. Sweet. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled Talking Politics 101, a constructive dialogue workshop, and is presented in partnership with the Bennion Center for Community Engagement. Today's presenter is Josh Schulruff, Bennion Center's Campus Dialogue Program Manager. Josh assumed this role in September 2024. His role coincides with other efforts to encourage lawful free expression on campus, including President Taylor Randall's Viewpoint Representation and Expression Task Force, Student Affairs work with the Constructive Dialogue Institute, and a new set of online training available to campus community members this fall titled Perspectives. Previously, Josh worked at James Madison University for 8 years at the university's Community Engagement and Volunteer Center, helping students learn how to engage in advocacy, write letters to members of Congress, organize their communities, and participate in service. The experience, he said, helped him understand the strong sense of social justice and inclination toward advocacy that motivated many college students today. Their passion coincides with a point in U.S. history defined by political division and displacement. Please join me in welcoming Josh to the Hinckley Institute.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you for being here, and thanks for the introduction. So yes, I'm Josh. I use he, him, his, and this is meant to be a constructive dialogue workshop focused around talking politics. So I know that the Hinckley Institute does just an array of wonderful, impactful things, including lots of opportunities to discuss policy or to have policymakers come and share their perspectives. I think part of the reason I'm here is that there aren't always as many opportunities to talk with one another about politics, and that's something that's sort of a challenge across the board right now. So part of the reason my role exists is to address that. It's a pretty well-documented problem we're trying to address. So this is actually from the Constructive Dialogue Institute's research. 45% of students, and I think this data is 2022, so this is like before October 7th, before the most recent election. You can kind of guess which way trends are. But at that time, 45% of students said that they were somewhat or very often afraid to share their views out of fear of offending their peers. And if you look at that broken down by people's political identification, folks who are very conservative goes all the way up to 64%. So there's like twice as high a response for that as folks who identify as very liberal. On the flip side, a quarter of college students are somewhat or very often offended by perspectives that are shared by peers in the classroom. And that's the other thing to note here. This is like just in the classroom. And think about how much of your life is happening outside of the classroom, online, all the other places where this comes into play. In this case, there are still some divisions around political ideology. Specifically, liberal students tend to report higher numbers here than conservative. Also, if you compare folks who identify as trans or non-binary compared to men, students of color in general, compared to white students, you'll see that their numbers tend to be a little higher. But then look at this. 94% of college students agree that we should listen to others with an open mind, including those with whom we disagree. So when you get down to it, everybody comes to college wanting to learn from one another. Everyone has this baseline view that listening and learning from each other is important, even especially those we disagree with. Something's getting in the way. And this is all focused on college campuses, but I think we know that this is not something that's just limited to college. This is something that's an issue across the board in our country right now. Polarization is at record high levels, and you feel it, right? So the university has invested in some tools from the Constructive Dialogue Institute, CDI. It's a national organization. They do a bunch of things, but a lot of the focus of their work is with universities, and specifically this program called Perspectives. So a lot of what I'm doing today is taken straight from Perspectives, and if you find it useful, I hope that on your way out, or when I bring the slide up at the end, you'll consider signing up for the whole program. So you've got me for about an hour today. Perspectives overall is mostly online. It's these 6 30-minute asynchronous lessons, and then we try and get people together for 3 in-person self-guided conversations, which are like really low-stakes opportunities to practice some of these skills that we'll be talking about today, and some that we won't get to today. So, Constructive Dialogue Institute, a constructive dialogue workshop. What is constructive dialogue? So this is CDI's definition: a form of conversation where people with different perspectives try to understand each other without giving up their own beliefs in order to live, learn, and work together. Another way to say it is these are skills for having conversations across difference where the goal is to understand one another better and not to destroy, own, vanquish, shame the other person. It's definitely not about trying to convince them they're wrong, convince them you're right. It's all about this mutual understanding. And in Perspectives, they really break it down into these 5 component skills. So 1 is letting go of winning. 2 is getting curious, sharing stories, navigating conflict with purpose, and finding what's shared. And in our time together, we're really going to focus on letting go of winning and getting curious. We're going to talk a little bit about why letting go of winning is a smart move, and a little bit of detail on one way folks can demonstrate curiosity when they're having political conversations. So, if you don't mind getting out your device of choice, this will lead you to a very short quiz. And if you could, when you've finished it, either put your device down or make meaningful eye contact with me or some other gauge so that I know you've done it. And I should say, when you get to the last screen where it gives you your results, please keep that open for a second. Looks like some of you are starting to get results. Please look up when you're great. We'll do about 30 seconds more. Okay, if you're still going through it, please continue. There's no need to rush. But if you've finished and you've got your score in front of you, and you feel comfortable doing so, I won't ask you any details, but if you have a perception gap that is greater than 0, will you please stand up? Interesting. Okay, so not 100%, but close to it. All right, if your perception gap is greater than or equal to 5%, we stay standing. Greater than or equal to 10%. 15? 20? 25? 30? 35? 40? 45? Going once, going twice. Okay, great. Thank you all for doing that and for being honest about where you fell. So what you should know is that the average perception gap for Democrats is 19%. And for Republicans, at least when this study was done, it's 27%. So if you were someone who never stood up, you're pretty unusual. And if you're someone who was able to sit down before 20%, you're actually lower than the averages, regardless of which of these parties you most identify with. The thing just to look at this, so the little yellow lines are self-reported independents. So you can see that in general, the gaps are a little smaller between independents in either of the parties compared to folks who identify more strongly with one of the two parties. So here's the thing. We come into political conversations with a lot of assumptions. And a lot of what we think we know about a Republican or a Democrat or a libertarian, an independent, it's just wrong. And this is just averages, right? Like there is so much heterogeneity within people who identify with Democrats or Republicans. So if the idea of coming into a political conversation with this idea of I'm speaking to a representative of this group, you are coming in with all this baggage that does not reflect what that individual thinks. And so one reason to let go of winning is to ensure that you can actually encounter this person you're speaking with or this group of people you're speaking with as an individual or individuals. The other thing to know is that these gaps have really serious consequences that go beyond just political polarization. So have any of you taken a class with Samantha Moore-Berg in psychology? Yeah? Okay, so she's great, and this is her research we'll put up in a second. So she studies meta-perception, and the idea there is basically, what do you think the other person thinks about you? So an example is, one question that I know she and her research teams have asked is, how evolved do you think an average member of your party is on a scale of 0 to 100? And then they'll say, how evolved do you think a member of the other major party is on a scale of 0 to 100? And then the kicker question is, how evolved do you think that average member of the other party thinks that you are? And what you get is this graph. So let's kind of break it down. It's a little confusing. The two on the left that don't have the funny thought bubbles, that's how folks answer those first set of questions, right? And so you can see that actually both Democrats and Republicans tend to rank on average, members of the other party as slightly less human or use some degree of dehumanization. I don't think these are based just on that one question, but it's an example. So that's bad, right? But look at the gap when it gets to what do you think the other people rank you as? So Democrats think that like Republicans are ranking them as 30% human, and that's a huge gap. Same with Republicans. In fact, they're almost the same, those two right-hand graphs. So it's bad that we dehumanize each other, right? Can we agree on that? Yes? Okay, I got one nod. That's good. 2 nods, great. Hopefully you're representative. But the trick here is that the more we're convinced that the other people don't think we're human, the more convinced we are that they're not going to play fair, right? And as soon as you become convinced that the other side, which doesn't even view you as human, is cheating, then it's a little easier for you to justify cheating too. 1 second. So what's scariest to me about these graphs is that they're associated with support for various anti-democratic behaviors. The more that meta-perception gets out of whack, the more likely you are to support anti-democratic things. And it's usually not because you support authoritarianism. It's because you think that the other side doesn't even treat you like a human, and you've got to, you can't bring a knife to a gunfight, right? Sorry, you had a question? Well, and use the mic, please, because I think we're recording. You good? Okay, great. You were just ahead of me. Okay. So, if you come in looking for a fight or ready for a fight, it may be that you're coming from this place. It may be that you are approaching a conversation not as though you're about to interact with an individual who may identify with one of these groups, but that you are coming in to battle someone who doesn't even think you're human or doesn't respect your basic rights or any of these other things that could be true but might not be. So letting go of winning doesn't mean that you let go of your convictions, right? Plenty of good political conversations end without resolving any of the underlying disagreements. But it does mean that you are consciously setting this stuff aside so that you can interact with an individual and learn about them as an individual. So the second point is getting curious. And one thing I want to share with all of you in terms of getting curious is this idea, moral foundations theory. Have any of you encountered this in coursework or elsewhere? All right, maybe. Don't call on me, but maybe. Okay, great. So this is also a big part of the Perspectives program. Some of these are actually just screenshots I pulled. But the folks behind this theory really like to explain it using the analogy of taste. So here you go. We all have the same basic taste receptors on our tongues, with some variation. But we each end up with different preferences. Some of us really like sweet, some of us really like salty foods, some of us like everything. Some of us think cilantro tastes like soap. But based on all of these factors, even though we have that commonality, we end up with different preferences, right? Cultures have really different norms around foods. Our parents cook or buy specific foods that we become accustomed to. We, as we grow into our adulthood, have specific experiences. We eat meals that affect what we like and what we don't like. So the idea behind moral foundations theory is that just like there's this common set of taste buds or foundational tastes, there are a pretty consistent set of moral foundations that go across individuals, across cultures, and similarly, depending on the culture we're raised in, depending on our upbringing, depending on our unique life experiences, we're going to come out with different emphases of these underlying values, moral foundations, and also with different understandings of what they mean. So you can see there under that moral foundations theory, care, a bunch of different words, none of which are exact sympathies, right? Kindness, empathy, peace, charity. And then looking at fairness, we've got equality, justice, honesty, integrity. So all within that category, but things that are not exactly alike. Liberty, freedom, autonomy, individualism, independence, loyalty, faith, friendship, community, patriotism, authority, respect, tradition, duty, lawfulness, and then sanctity, spirituality, purity, faith, modesty. And those are just, example words of important things that could be categorized within these 6 basic groupings. And so what moral foundations theory says is that most of our deep disagreements, our deep conflicts, come not from totally different values, but from either different understandings of shared values or different emphases amongst this set of core values that we share. And then part of what the research shows is that when you look at people's political identities, you see a really interesting pattern about this. So I apologize, it's a little fuzzy. What you see here is on the y-axis, how important, of those, how high do you rank the different moral foundations? And then on the x-axis, are you very conservative, moderate, very liberal? And you can see as people go, if you look all the way at the liberal poll, I guess, folks who identify as very liberal on average are really emphasizing fairness, care, and liberty. There's a big gap over authority, sanctity, and loyalty, which when you think about it kind of makes sense if you're coming from a position of pushing change and being less conservative. And then on the other side, you see liberty goes way up, but it's clustered with all the others. So there's a much greater emphasis amongst those who identify as very conservative, on average, on those values, those foundations of authority, sanctity, and loyalty. And then, in the middle, there's all sorts of stuff, right? Just because that's a pattern at the extremes doesn't mean we should only think about the extremes. Most people, everybody, is going to be unique somehow in terms of their moral foundations and how they're expressed in their choices, their actions, and all that good stuff. Let me stop for a minute. What questions do you all have, or does anyone have a strong response to anything so far? Okay. In terms of this idea of getting curious, of curiosity, once you're aware of this, or once you have this viewpoint or this lens that you can bring to a political conversation, you can start listening for those moral statements, for things people are saying that are sort of giveaways for how their different foundations are either emphasized or de-emphasized. And then you can get curious about that and ask questions. But in lots of ways, listening is the first part. So what I'd like to do, and I realized I didn't test sound, so we'll see how this goes. But this is a documentary that was made by an organization called Resetting the Table. They do a lot of bridging work between different groups and are a really interesting organization. And they made this film in the lead up to the 2020 election. And they went to what they said was sort of the purplest counties in the country. So I forget exactly where they are, if they're in Wisconsin somewhere, but they're in a relatively rural area that has large numbers of both Democratic voters, Republican voters, independents, and the highest number of folks who switched from being an Obama voter to being a Trump voter in 2016. And basically, they brought them all together and started doing their thing. So I have here just a really short excerpt. The whole thing is actually short. It's like 21 minutes, so you should absolutely watch the whole thing. But what I want to do is just play you a couple minutes and ask you, as you're watching it, to listen for some of those moral foundations. And we'll come back in a second and talk about what you hear.
And she's been there forever.
Look at our groups and what you said. I mean, here you have a master's degree, you're highly educated, very intelligent, and you've got a huge student debt. I think you said like $19,000?
Oh, no, $130,000.
$130,000. So, could you vote for a Democrat candidate who says, okay, come on in, free college?
Sure.
So you're,
I want everyone to have access to education.
so you're still willing to eat that $130,000
Yes.
in debt? Whoa.
I know I'm radical. It's
Isn't that putting
scary.
you at a disadvantage?
Yes.
Wow.
I don't want people to struggle as hard after me. I want people to find value in each other and to find value in community. And if that means me sitting here and being in debt the rest of my life while someone else gets a free ride, like, cool. Like, I really hope that when you get that education, you see the value in yourself and what you can give the community. And then that will come back in return for me. I play the long game.
Let's talk about the long game for a second. What about the people that came before you?
What do you mean?
Well, I've been working for 55 years. I still have to work till the day I drop because my pension is diminishing with each dollar.
Just so we're clear on what's
Yeah.
being said here, you're saying, well, I'm still here actually, and the policies you're talking about are going to harm me.
And the money, my earning capacity keeps going down the older I get. I'm wearing out.
I'm also willing to give you what you need.
I don't want you to give. I've earned it.
It's not about that.
There's, I think, an underlying difference here that's emerging. You're saying in terms of policy, the very problem he's naming, well, that's something we can and should address. That's not right. And it sounded like what you're saying is, I don't want that.
Throw the old dog a bone.
No.
I won't take it.
It's about
Okay. So, who heard any moral statements in that? Front row. What'd you hear?
So just sort of like this broad idea of like fairness, in sort of policy. So the idea that like if I beget some sort of cost in education, then other people should also have to deal with that cost in education. Just sort of this continuation of that.
Gotcha. So it would be unfair if I had to pay for college for other people to get a full ride. Awesome. Fairness. What did you hear?
Yeah, and the older gentleman also talked a lot about how he has worked and he honestly wants to continue to work. He believes that, I'm kind of might be reading too deep into it, but he believes there is something edifying in that process, that he's becoming a better person, that he can receive his own personal liberty by becoming dependent on only himself.
Gotcha.
And he's worried that if something else comes in to replace that, he's going to lose that as well.
So you're connecting his worth ethic to a sense of liberty, self-reliance, not relying on others. Thank you.
And the woman really emphasized community and value in friendships and learning from one another and being able to continue that growth and like progressiveness within education and valuing the person that others are as well as the person that you are and the contributions that they can give you rather than like the contributions you can give for yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and before you give the mic back, of those, sorry, let me see if I can bring this back up. But of those moral foundations, those 6, like fairness, sorry. So which of these things would you categorize, those things you just noticed under? It could be one, it could be many.
I think care and loyalty to community and friendship.
Okay, got it. So he had a very strong response to her expressing a desire to care for him, right? It did not land well. Yes, sir.
I think on the flip side, he seemed, at least to me, he seemed more invested in liberty, especially maybe the autonomy sub-value, where it seemed like he was kind of like, you touched on this, kind of like proud of what he had achieved with his work and kind of like his independence without having someone kind of hand it to him maybe.
Yeah, I think that's really driving with what we heard here, and I think you're both right. And then the other thing to connect that to that is sort of implied here, but is more explicit if you watch more of the film, is like, what's the relation of government here? He doesn't want to accept that care because part of what he values is a certain liberty from government interference in his life. Did you also want to chime in?
I was just going to add to that a little bit, and I was going to say that it definitely shows their different like amounts of like care that they put into like the different foundation, like moral foundations. For example, that guy was way more into liberty, but he also seemed to be appealing more to that woman's liberty. He's like, oh, don't you care that that people nowadays can live free of student debt while you do. And she is just like less, she's less attracted by that Liberty Foundation. She's, much more shown to be like care of fairness, which might mean she's a Democrat or vice versa.
Yeah. And I think another way to look at it is they both, I think, express some version of fairness, right? We've already heard his expression of fairness was more like, if I had to do this, it's only fair that other people also have to do it. Or if you are $130,000 in debt, you would be at a disadvantage if people after you got a free ride. How would folks express her version of fairness? Someone who hasn't gone yet? Yes, please.
Like my take on her expression of fairness?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it was more based on like opportunity, kind of like giving people equal access to education regardless of like how much they have to spend or how much debt they're willing to go into.
Gotcha. So less about equal treatment, more about opportunity, or potentially even, well, yeah, opportunity is great. Was there someone who wanted to add over here? Hand is down. Okay. The other thing I've heard a few of you express is that, so I'm sorry, let me back up. So that's actually in the research pretty common, that there will be some predictable distinctions related to political ideology and how people understand these terms. So, for example, you'll see sometimes, liberals care about, and these are obviously broad strokes, generalizations on average, but that liberals are more likely to understand liberty in terms of freedom from oppression, right? And maybe that comes across as access, whereas conservative folks are more likely, on average, to understand liberty in terms of freedom from government interference or freedom from threats to one's autonomy. So I think you're all picking up on that. In terms of, let's see, what else is on there? Yeah, in terms of fairness, sometimes we talk about like, equity and equality are not the same. Liberal folks might have a greater focus on outcomes, whereas folks who are more on the right politically tend to have a greater emphasis on proportionality. You should get out a share equal to what you put in. So it's not that just because we can identify that the person we're talking to is also motivated by liberty, that we're like on the same page, right? There are some huge divides that we are just categorizing in a different way. But listening for them helps us to have a place to start, right? And it can just guide the way we hear another person's speech. And listening in terms of how is someone I disagree with expressing their values and what they're saying to me right now is just an exercise in empathy, right? You're assuming that that person is coming from a place of values that on some level you share, right? In addition to all the differences, you're not speaking to an evil person. That person is probably not a Nazi. And no matter what you learn about the ways you disagree, if you're listening for these moral foundations, you are listening for something you might have in common, or at least be able to talk about from a common place, right? You and I seem to understand this idea of freedom really differently. So, if you're really curious, you want to ask some questions, right? So, who has something they would like to know about either of those people after just watching those few minutes? Who is curious to learn something about them? Yes, can you bring it up, please?
Me and somebody else mentioned how the older man seemed to be talking from the value of liberty. Is that true? Is that what he was advocating for?
That's so great. So, like, first thing you want to do is check, am I hearing and understanding you correctly? Which is so beautiful and so important. So yes, let's just highlight that. Like, this is what I think I'm hearing. Am I right? Am I getting you? And then you can go from there. That's awesome. Who else has something they're curious about? Anyone else want to know how she ended up $130,000 in debt? Like, and how do you feel about that? Like, has that degree paid off for you? Is paid off even the right way to talk about it? Oh my gosh, did you know that when you went in? It's a big number. Any other things? Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious to know why he thinks that. Sorry, why he thinks that like having the government help him when he's old is like taking a freebie when he's been paying taxes his whole life and everything. Most conservatives I know feel like they don't get like they pay money into the government and they don't get what they should be getting out of it in terms of that. So I don't know why he thinks that him getting helped when he literally can't work anymore is like taking a freebie.
Why is that throwing an old dog a bone? Where does that come from? That's great. Maybe one more in the back. You're getting your steps.
My thought process is more like, what did the dude go through when he was younger to build up so much like resentment to see somebody else succeed in a more easier way than he did? Or like, what challenges did he go through that made him look at everybody else and say like, that's not fair because that's not what happened to me? And just like what truly hurt him?
Yeah. I mean, there are some assumptions baked into that, right? Like, it could be a value that he was explicitly raised with from a parent. It could be specific life experiences. But yeah, where does this come from? Can you tell me more about why you think that? All of those good things. Okay, so thank you. You're curious about some of the same things I am, although I'm surprised debt isn't jumping in your minds. Maybe it feels too close to home right now. Sorry, too soon. But what I'd like you to do now is just brainstorm a couple of questions that you could ask either of these folks. I'd like you to do it with a friend. So please, if you could pair up with someone you're sitting next to or sitting near, I'll give you like 90 seconds and just brainstorm as many different questions that you can think of to ask either of these people that you feel like would be constructive. And then I'm going to ask you to share them. Yes, and your nearest person might be behind you. We'll do maybe 30 seconds left. Please be sure you can share out a few questions. All right. Finish this question, wrap it up, Bring it home. Cool. Thank you all for brainstorming. That's great. Okay, let's start back in this corner, if you don't mind. Could you share just one question that you think would be constructive to ask either person?
Yeah, we talked about asking the person if there was anything in their life that led them to believe a certain thing.
Okay. Great. How do people feel about that? Thumbs? I'm seeing mostly thumbs up. Awesome. This next group over here, did you all come up with a question you feel comfortable sharing? Okay, let's bring it up.
I don't really know how to phrase this, but we kind of talked a little bit about fairness. I think they both believe in fairness, but they believe in very different aspects of it, and it would be nice to hear what they actually think about the idea of fairness and how they interpret that.
Okay, so who wants to put that in the phrase of a question you might actually ask? You may have done it. And
sorry, I was handing it to them. What did you say?
No, that's great. What I heard you say was something like, it sounds like you two have very different definitions of fairness. What does fairness mean to each of you?
Yeah, that's
close enough?
Yeah.
Okay, great. How do people feel about that one? Awesome. Thank you. Yes.
I feel like I would ask them like if they were parents and like how they would feel if it was their kids they were talking about.
Okay, so sort of two questions. One to get a sense of like, are you parents? How do people feel about that one? Seeing lots of thumbs. Is there a possibility? Let's do it this way. I'm going to ask it two different ways. Are you a parent? How would you feel if that was your kid going through that? Are you a parent? How do you feel about your kid taking on that much debt? Or how does that influence? Cool. Is one of those better? Okay. You would only ask it the nice way, I know. All right, great. Please keep it coming. These are good. These are wonderful.
So we talked about how we'd ask the gentleman if, like, what role community played in his life and if he saw himself as a part of a group bigger than himself.
Awesome. So you're noticing that he's not connecting to government with community, but you're wondering if community is still an important value. Awesome. I'm giving myself away, but are you all feeling good about that? If any of you feel like a question is not going to work or is problematic, please, it's not personal. Let's talk about it. Is that where you're at? No, okay. We'll get to you too, I promise.
Something we thought to ask was the role education has played in their lives, respectively, if at all. So, like, for example, she was talking about student debt, and she seemed a little more open to it. So did she, pursue more education and, like, have a career path that was involved with that? And he was very against student debt, so did he pursue a career path that was, like, not really involved with education, so he just didn't really, like, see the point of it as much?
Nice. Okay, so a question about just what sort of education you have and what your attitudes about it. And can we shuttle it over to this side? It looks like someone in the back is ready. We'll just take a few more.
I think a lot of what matters is what politics are like the biggest headlines in when they were kind of either studying or maybe growing up. That older gentleman maybe looked like he was in his 60s, which means he could have been like influenced in part due to Reagan. And Reaganomics talk a lot about like, bootstrap politics and, pulling yourself up, doing it yourself. And so maybe that influences how he like sees it. Maybe it should be more independent rather.
Gotcha. Yeah. So maybe a question like who really influenced your politics, and that would give you maybe it's Ronald Reagan, maybe it's my dad, maybe it's Ronald Reagan and my dad. But yeah, that's really thoughtful, thinking about where different generations and different influences people encounter. That's awesome. Can we get maybe one more from this side?
One of the questions we thought of was like what he would think the solution to some of that student debt problems are, because he seemed pretty against the like 130,000 number, but in his mind he thinks that her solution would be to just get rid of student debt, and I would like to know what like he thinks the better solution would be.
Gotcha. So we know he has a strong response to that student debt figure, but we don't have a lot of sense of how he understands the problem or what he would want to do to fix it. That's great. These are all wonderful questions. You probably didn't need to come here today, but I'm glad you did. But let's generalize it a little, and you can shout them out, and I will repeat them into the mic for posterity. But if we sort of take all these great questions you generated, can we generalize some principles about what makes, when you're having a potentially fraught political conversation, what makes for a constructive question? Or if it's easier to frame in the negative, like, what shouldn't you do? So, yeah.
Framing the question in a way where you're not trying to trap them into a position or make them claim anything. You're just asking them, what do you think about this?
Got you. I am legit asking you a question. I'm not trying to pin you down. I'm not using it as like a debating tactic. I actually want to know. I'm actually curious. Great.
One would be like creating a question that could take into account their personal experiences. So it's kind of like what we said about pinning down. Doesn't feel like you're shoving them into a position, but rather they can build their position around their own experiences.
Yeah, and another way of saying that, and a lot of you pointed out at this, is like, tell me a story, right? Like, I want to hear something about your life. Yeah. That's great. So you are framing your question, which might point to a difference in terms of something that you can relate to, that you empathize with, that you resonate with, something that's based on common ground of some sort. Wonderful. Any other thoughts? Yeah, shout it out.
Maybe being more careful about like the things you ask about, like even politics, I'd be like maybe a little bit worried to ask about because a lot of people are defensive about it, like we discussed at the beginning. And so maybe we can find out like traits of your political preferences based on other questions that we can ask that aren't necessarily as aggressive or invasive.
Okay, so maybe the tact isn't just to be like, so I'm trying to think of a example of what not to do that's not also terribly offensive in this setting, but just like, so you want to split families up at the border, right? Not the way to go. Okay, so things like that. Yes.
I agree with that last question, but I think I would nuance it where I think it would probably be best to avoid framing political questions in inflammatory ways like you demonstrated. But at the same time, I think kind of maybe dancing around political issues would also be unproductive because then you might be making assumptions. So I think like a good mix of asking political questions in a way that kind of that is more kind of open to discussion, and also throwing in maybe some like more personal questions to try to connect with someone. But again, I don't think that just ignoring the political aspect is like the best solution.
Right. In some cases, we're either shouting at each other or totally avoiding each other or totally avoiding these topics, and it would be nice to have someplace in between where we could actually learn from each other. So yeah, I mean, one thing I heard you say was ask things that are more open-ended. And then also I heard you connecting back to this idea of stories or lived experience. So I think that makes sense. Well, these are some tips that I pulled from perspectives from the Constructive Dialogue Institute, and I think you'll see that you've generated a lot of them. So questions that are open-ended, where you're not expecting an answer, where someone can tell you something more than yes or no. This was said almost verbatim, being genuinely curious. You're not asking a rhetorical question to trap somebody. Inviting stories, this came up as well, relating people's, not just what positions they hold, but how did they come to hold those positions? Why is this important to you? You know, what happened in your life that made you feel this way? Things that you all have been saying. This one I think you all implied, but it didn't come out as explicitly. You know, a good question leans into nuance and goes kind of below those headlines on party and position. And then this was, me being a jerk earlier, but like, how are you communicating curiosity beyond the specific words you're using? How can you adopt a curious tone and open body language? All those things that demonstrate that you're genuinely curious and want to know and listen to the answer. You're not just planning to respond and jump on them. Okay. We are almost done. But I do, since you are here in the Hinckley Institute of Politics, I do want to acknowledge that talking politics and doing politics are sometimes very different. It would probably be good for all of us if more of our elected officials, more of our politicians spent time engaging in conversations with one another where they're genuinely curious and they're able to let go of winning a little bit. But there are elements of doing politics that are zero sum, right? Like someone has to win that election. That bill is either going to pass or it's not going to pass. So in case there are people in this room who are very focused on sort of the doing politics, thinking about how do you persuade people to get the results you want, how do you activate people to get the results you want, I want to, this is Rob Willer. He's a social psychologist, and he's got a little bit to say about why these techniques are still useful, even in those more combative zero-sum situations. So give me a second to cue it up correctly.
You can see right away why we're in trouble here, right? People's moral values, I mean, they're their most deeply held beliefs. People are willing to fight and die for their values. Why are they going to give that up just to agree with you on something that they don't particularly want to agree with you on anyway? If that persuasive appeal that you're making to your Republican uncle means that he doesn't just have to change his view, he's got to change his underlying values too, that's not going to go very far. So what would work better? Well, we believe it's a technique that we call moral reframing, and we've studied it in a series of experiments. In one of these experiments, we recruited liberals and conservatives to a study where they read one of 3 essays before having their environmental attitudes surveyed. And the first of these essays was a relatively conventional pro-environmental essay that invoked the liberal values of care and protection from harm. It said things like, in many important ways, we are causing real harm to the places we live in, and it is essential that we take steps now to prevent further destruction from being done to our Earth. Another group of participants were assigned to read a really different essay that was designed to tap into the conservative value of moral purity. It was a pro-environmental essay as well, and it said things like, keeping our forests, drinking water, and skies pure is of vital importance. We should regard the pollution of the places we live in to be disgusting. And reducing pollution can help us preserve what is pure and beautiful about the places we live. And then we had a third group of participants that were assigned to read just a non-political essay. It was just a comparison group, so we could get a baseline. And what we found when we surveyed people about their environmental attitudes afterwards, we found that liberals, it didn't really matter what essay they read. They tended to have highly pro-environmental attitudes regardless. Liberals are on board for environmental protection. Conservatives, however, were significantly more supportive of progressive environmental policies and environmental protection if they had read the moral purity essay than if they read one of the other 2 essays. We even found that conservatives who read the moral purity essay were significantly more likely to say that they believed in global warming and were concerned about global warming, even though this essay didn't even mention global warming. That's just a related environmental issue. But that's how robust this moral reframing effect was. And
so, even if your goal ultimately is to change someone's mind or get someone on board with your policy or your candidate's policy or your candidate, think about this as the first step. How can you develop mutual understanding? How can you get a sense of the values that motivate that person and a sense of where they differ from you? And then if you are going to try and take that conversation further, you know, how can you frame what's important to you in terms of values that might be driving their decisions? So I really want to thank you all for coming and challenge you in the next week or so. If you can start a conversation with someone you've been avoiding or a topic you've been avoiding, and you can do it in a way that leads with curiosity, that drops that warrior mentality, and share a little bit of your story in so doing, whether you change someone's mind or just come away with a better understanding. And also, equally importantly, to have that other person come away with a better understanding of you, right? That's important too. Hopefully, it can be a small step towards changing the culture here on campus and more broadly. I do have some references here that I will put up, and I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who'd like them. And then if this feels like a taste of something you'd like to do more of, please, 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 please sign up for Perspectives. You can do it here. There's a poster on your way out on the table you can grab also. And also, sort of relatedly, the other half of my job is really focused on supporting student activists and organizers. We have something called the Demonstration and Activity Resource Team that's meant to be a support to folks before, during, and after their actions. And if you feel like you would like to contribute to that work or even just learn more about it, please let me know, because we are trying to get more students involved on that team. And I'll just say thank you very much. And thank you so much for having me. And I think there's probably more pizza, so don't be shy. Is that true? Should they not be shy about more pizza? More pizza, yeah. There's cheese and veggies, no pepperoni. Awesome. Thanks, everybody.